Where did Joe Biden fail? From the economy to immigration and wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, the outgoing US president is widely said to have achieved too little. So what went wrong and where does that leave the Democratic Party? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Tom McRae. Across the United States, leading Democrats are looking at how and why they lost significant ground in the presidential election. Some are blaming President Joe Biden for the defeat of Kamala Harris, who only had 4 months to run her campaign. Now, the list of critiques is long, from not dropping out of the race sooner to a disconnection with working class and male voters. At the polls, the economy, the wars in Ukraine and Gaza, and a surge in illegal immigration all played a role. So what does this mean for the Democratic Party, and will this decisive defeat force it to reassess some of its policies? We'll explore these issues with our guests in just a moment, but first, this report from Katia Lopez-Horian.
As a career politician, Joe Biden has served as U.S. President, Vice President, and a longtime senator. But now it seems his legacy will become tied to Donald Trump's re-election.
On January 20th, we'll have a peaceful transfer of power here in America.
Running as a presidential candidate, it seems millions of U.S. voters felt Kamala Harris didn't do enough to separate herself from Biden's policies. Analysts say she lost millions of undecided voters following an interview on a U.S. morning talk show.
Would you have done something differently than President Biden during the past 4 years?
There is not a thing that comes to mind.
That became a growing issue. Despite a strong economy and lowered inflation during Biden's presidency, millions of people said they were living paycheck to paycheck and struggling to make ends meet.
The reality is, when it comes to those economic indicators that voters feel, not the ones that are talked about on, financial news programs, take-home pay was reduced. Gas prices are higher. Home energy prices are higher.
And many blame the Biden administration for a record-breaking surge in illegal immigration across its southern border. Abroad, his administration poured billions of dollars into Israel's war on Gaza, as well as financial support for Ukraine as it fights Russia. Policies that also frustrated voters.
I will never apologize for defending America. I will protect our workers.
Democrats were hoping Trump's mounting legal troubles and the Capitol riots 3 years ago would lead voters to Harris. They were proved wrong at the polls, though, ultimately highlighting cracks in Democrats' messaging, particularly with working class and male voters.
I think everybody's trying to do all of this hand-wringing and understanding of why the Democrats lost, and in the end it was because they weren't catering to the people that matter, the people that were actually the voters.
Now faced with defeat, Democrats are reassessing what went wrong under Biden and whether the party will need to redirect its course. Katia Lopez-Horian, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Okay, let's bring in our guest now. In San Francisco, Stephen Zunes, Professor of Politics and the founding Chair of Middle Eastern Studies at the University of San Francisco. In Brunswick, Maine, Andrew Rudalevitch, Thomas Brackett Reed Professor of Government at Bowdoin College. And in Wicklow Island, Scott Lucas is a Professor of International Politics at the Clinton Institute, University College Dublin. Thank you so much for being with us here on Inside Story today. Plenty to get through, because everyone thought that this election was going to be extraordinarily close. It wasn't. Trump won overwhelmingly. Stephen, if we can start with you. Plenty of hand-wringing going on by the Democrats. How much of the blame for Harris losing can be laid at the feet of Joe Biden?
Very much so. I think that Biden was really pretty tone deaf, I think, to a lot of concerns that ordinary Americans had. He was very much from the centrist wing of the party, of kind of an old style, that I was not in touch with the fact that the United States is falling behind many countries in terms of meeting the basic needs of people. We do not have universal health care that most countries have. We don't have the social safety net overall. Public transportation and housing does not get the kind of support it does in most advanced industrialized countries. As a result, when things are tight, people don't have as much to fall back on. And similarly, he alienated many people in the left wing of the party, especially young people, as well as Arab Americans and Muslims, because of his continued support for a genocidal war in Gaza. Not only did that lead to more people supporting minor party candidates, but the kind of voter enthusiasm, the kind of campaign support, the army of young people that come out and go door to door was reduced as a result. So I think a combination of things made it very difficult for Harris to really connect to folks, in part because the dilemma of being a sitting vice president is that you can't really separate yourself too far from the sitting president without seeming disloyal and divisive. In fact, only 4 vice presidents have even tried in the past 150 years, and 3 of them lost. Now 4.
Yeah. Andrew, do you think that Joe Biden will be remembered as the person who vanquished Donald Trump in 2020 and ended his own election campaign for the good of the country and the party? Or will he be remembered as a one-term president who basically set up the Democrats for failure?
Well, I think we have a similar situation in 2020 and 24 in at least one respect, which is that an unpopular incumbent lost both elections. It just happens that Donald Trump is in 2020 an unpopular incumbent, and in 2024 he is the agent of change. And despite his record as president, that was pretty quickly forgiven, frankly, even by voters who didn't like him 4 years earlier. They looked back on his time in office more happily. He didn't win overwhelmingly. I've just pushed back on that point a little bit. Swing state by swing state, these are 1-2 percentage margins. So his win is going to be very slightly larger than it was in 2016, about the same as Joe Biden's in 2020. We don't think of those as mandate elections per se, but certainly the swing was broad enough. And you do have to, I think, look at the late decision by President Biden not to run again, and sort of the inheritance, therefore, that Vice President Harris has, unable really to separate herself from an unpopular incumbent, fairly or not. He is certainly unpopular, about 40% approval ratings. And, as you showed on your clip, she didn't do a very good job of separating herself from that administration. Whether she could have or not, open question. But I think Biden's legacy is going to be one where he had a chance maybe to sort of vanquish Trumpism, but was unable to do that.
I guess everything is much easier in hindsight to try and assess exactly where Kamala Harris and Joe Biden fell short when it came to retaining the White House. Scott, when it comes to assessing Biden's time in office, the last 4 years, I mean, how difficult is it going to be to actually separate fact from all of the misinformation that has been put out there by Donald Trump and his allies? Can you just explain the perception versus the reality of what he's managed to achieve in his time in office?
I think you've illustrated that facts versus perception difficulty already by the way a lot of this debate is being framed. We could talk about the facts of a Biden administration, which, having inherited an economy in crisis and a country in crisis amidst the pandemic, amidst the attempted coup of Donald Trump in 2021. And we could talk about the fact that, yes, inflation went up to 9% in 2022 as you dealt with supply chain shocks, as you dealt with other compromises in the global economy because of COVID, as you dealt with rising energy prices. But you could say in 2024 that inflation had been brought down to 2.4%, and that the Federal Reserve, almost unprecedentedly, had brought a soft landing out of that period. You could talk about the fact that GDP was growing at 3.5%. Which many countries in Europe would envy. You could talk about the fact that unemployment was at its lowest rate since the 1960s, while recognizing that the questions of what type of jobs you have in the economy is an ongoing concern. You could talk about all of the legislation, probably the most significant legislation since the 1960s that was passed by the Biden administration, some of which will filter through now in terms of its effect during the Trump years, from the Coronavirus Relief Act to the infrastructure bill, to the CHIPS Act, to the slimmed down version of Build Back Better for a green economy, for trying to expand Obamacare, and for trying to deal with issues such as education and housing. Now, had that solved all of America's problems? Absolutely not. But the argument here is that, it was arguably trying to make a difference and making a significant difference in an economy versus a Trump administration that had actually damaged it. But facts versus perception is what matters. Let me just give you one other thing on immigration.
Hang on a sec, Scott. But despite all of his achievements, he wasn't able to sell that to the American people, and he was deeply unpopular well before he dropped out of the race.
Yeah, and again, I think you have to talk about the fact that part of this is a communication question, and that part of it was the failure of Biden and indeed Harris to communicate effectively to the American public. I think part of it is, however, a very damaged media environment. Many Americans will get their news from outlets that, in fact, are just simply there to bash, a certain part of the American electorate, the center and the left. In other words, they're right-wing, pro-Trump outlets, and they weren't going to give any positive spin to Biden and Harris. But even the mainstream media tried to play both sides quite often in this. And I'll give you that quick example very quickly. If you were to talk about immigration in 2024, well, first of all, immigration surged from 2019 to 2022, which will span the Trump and Biden periods. In 2024, undocumented immigration across the U.S.-Mexico border is down 77%. But how often would you have heard that in the American media, or indeed the international media, in the last few weeks?
Stephen, if we can come to you, just staying on the economy, we'll get into the immigration issue in just a moment. But when it comes to the economy, when Scott there outlined a number of Biden's achievements over the last 4 years, do you think he'll be remembered for those when it comes to his legacy?
I think academics probably will, because the statistics are pretty straightforward, are pretty clear. It was a very successful presidency in that regard. But unfortunately, as was noted, the media environment in this country is dominated by far-right outlets that have an ideological agenda. There was the problem of bots from Russia and others who are putting out false information on social media, and the mainstream media trying to be balanced, even when the facts were pretty solidly on one side. And this is rather disturbing that things have come to this level. I mean, on the one hand, the United States has one of the most highly educated populations in the world. However, there is this kind of vulnerability to very superficial and ideologically driven analysis that makes the Democratic Party, which is a very centrist party by European and most nations' standards, appear to be far left. And the Republican Party, which has now been taken over by far-right nationalists, very similar to the far-right powers we do see in Europe as a minority, to come across as mainstream. And so I think that will certainly taint the way that Americans will see the Biden presidency and the two-party system during this period.
I mean, all the candidates, most of Americans knew how fractured, especially the media is when it comes to America, and the amount of misinformation and disinformation that was going to be spewed out through this election. That was all known well ahead of time. Why wasn't Harris and Biden, why weren't they able to convince America that the economy was actually getting better under their administration, Andrew? Why weren't they able to cut through to the people in the same way that Donald Trump did so successfully?
Yeah, it's the polarization that my colleagues have mentioned here is intriguing. It's going to work to Trump's benefit very shortly. I suspect that on January 21st, he will declare that inflation is vanquished, that in fact the economy is the envy of the world. He's solved the problems already. And you will see a big switch in Republicans who think the economy is terrific and some number of Democrats will think that suddenly it's not so great as well. We tend to see even facts in this country at the moment through a party-colored lens. It's tricky. I mean, I think part of the issue for Biden was that, he did pass, right, a very big COVID stimulus act at the beginning of his administration that did boost people's paychecks, but that faded. And certainly by 2024, people had forgotten about it or sort of rolled it into the prior stimuli as well. The Inflation Reduction Act, which was the sort of version of Build Back Better that made it through Congress, again, has a huge amount of money for investment in green energy and other infrastructure, combined with the sort of other physical infrastructure investments passed by Congress, but those haven't actually hit the ground in many cases yet. So again, there's a lot of money in the pipeline, almost the literal pipeline in some cases, again, hasn't really affected people's lives. Trump did play very well, I thought, on the fact that, he got kind of a pass for the economic collapse of 2020. Nobody blamed him for that. That was a worldwide pandemic. I won't say nobody. And how he managed it certainly is blameworthy in regards. But, again, looking back, people thought, oh, gas prices were low. That was to Trump's credit, but the fact that gas prices were low because the economy had cratered, he didn't get blamed for that. And the campaign certainly played up those issues in ways that I thought, did resonate with people who had this sort of, again, retrospective, half memory of the Trump administration as being rather more successful, perhaps, than it was. And of course, that's combined with a big tranche of Trump fans who had never given up and were enthusiastic about his return, as we saw in the primary season.
Yeah, it certainly feels like a lot of people have short memories when it comes to looking back at Trump's first 4 years in office. I mean, Bernie Sanders, as well as many others, Scott, have basically said Trump won because Democrats abandoned working class people. Do you agree with that sentiment? Because we did hear in the story that played at the very beginning of this program that when people are sitting around their kitchen table, it's really they vote on how they feel now. Are they worse off now than they were a few years ago? And the majority of people said that they aren't doing as well as they were when Trump was president, rightly or wrongly. That's how they feel.
Well, I think we're in a period right now, as happens with any party that loses an election, and especially in a critical time like America has, that you're going to get a lot of self-flagellation and you're going to get a lot of sniping within. And that is going to be framed, I think, as part of center versus left. Now, I think there is ground to talk about how much further America should go in terms of healthcare, as Stephen has pointed out, how much further it should go in terms of extending that social net. And of course, we haven't even discussed foreign policy, how much further the Biden administration should have done to adopt a more progressive view, progressive in the sense of saving lives in Gaza. But I think to an extent, Sanders is just sort of lashing out a bit. As much as I admire Bernie Sanders, he was there through the Biden administration as it passed this legislation. He has been there, of course, through the Obama and Biden administrations, as you did get Affordable Care Act, which needs to be expanded, but at least you got Obamacare. He has been there when you tried to help working class Americans come out of the pandemic. So I think it's a little bit unfair to say that the administration didn't do anything to help working people. Could they do more? Should they do more? Absolutely. But that should be part of a constructive discussion going forward, rather than one to try to rip up the Democrats in a center versus left battle.
OK. Stephen, I want to go back to 2022 because a poll found then that only 26% of Democrats wanted Joe Biden to run again, yet, as we know, he still did. I mean, could all of this have been avoided if the Democratic leaders at that time actually stood up to him sooner and say, we don't think that you should run for a second term, and actually have an open primary to choose the right candidate to take on Donald Trump?
It would have probably helped. I think on the one hand, the American election season is ridiculously long in any case. I mean, to say it was only 4 months, I mean, most parliamentary systems, their election campaign is maybe 6 weeks at the most. So it's not the length per se, but I think perhaps some vetting would have been helpful in terms of people being able to express their preferences of the candidates and more discussion of policies where people would have been able to distance themselves perhaps more from Biden's unpopular policies. And there would have been a more sense of ownership, I guess you could say, of the candidate instead of the de facto selection of the unpopular incumbent vice president. And so, yes, I do believe that he should have stepped aside sooner. That was certainly the wish, as you noted, of the majority of Democrats, and his unpopularity on a whole number of levels, from his age to the Gaza war and other things, made his vice president vulnerable.
Yeah, I want to get onto the Gaza war now, because obviously that is had such a huge impact here in the Middle East, but also right around the world, and potentially from what we're hearing and seeing in the voting when it came to Harris. 43,000 people are dead in Gaza. I mean, the tension in the entire region is at a level that we haven't seen in a long, long time. Biden spent billions of dollars in military aid, giving military aid to Israel. Andrew, can you just give us an idea of what you think Biden's legacy will be when it comes to the Middle East, especially to Gaza?
Yeah, well, I don't think there's any question that after the Hamas attacks on October 7th, that the U.S. would come strongly to the defense of Israel at that point, right? As the war has gone on, I think there have been high expectations that the U.S. would be able to use its leverage, funding, what have you, to end things, right? To rein in Israel more than it's been able to do. I think that's always been something of a misconception, the idea that the U.S. would direct Israeli behavior, especially when you have a prime minister there who is fighting in his own domestic political battles in ways that lead him towards, I think, often extreme behavior and not helpful to the wider resolution of peace in the region. Biden, has long experience, in U.S. foreign policy, and I think he has struggled somewhat to assert himself in this regard. I mean, this war is not the United States' fault. The war in Ukraine, it's not the United States' fault. Biden got tarred with it somehow. I think maybe there's a sort of perception, this is back in 2021, right? The withdrawal from Afghanistan was a Trump policy. He negotiated directly with the Taliban, actually sidelining the actual Afghan government to do so. Biden, though, actually agreed with the idea of withdrawing. But when the U.S. did, of course, it was chaotic, and the immediate reaction in Afghanistan by the Taliban, resurgent, has been to crack down on human rights. And the reaction here has been largely negative to that. So his sort of veneer of competence in foreign policy, I think, wore off relatively quickly in his term. And again, I think the U.S. has been, buffeted somewhat. I think in terms of Ukraine, Biden has actually, from my perspective, done the right thing. He's been extremely supportive of Ukraine's government trying to funnel weapons and money. And I suspect President Trump, when he returns to office, will not be so supportive. He's talked about ending the war in a day, which presumably means allowing Russia to have what it wants. But he, too, will be, I think, even more supportive of Israel than Biden has been. And so I think those on the left in the U.S. who held their noses, refused to vote for the vice president on the basis of her position or Biden's position in Gaza are going to have a rude awakening with regards to what happens there next under Trump.
Scott, there has been deep criticism of Biden because it seems like there's been a failure to hold Benjamin Netanyahu back at all. I mean, there's no ceasefire agreement, despite Antony Blinken coming to the region maybe 11 or 12 times, I think it is now. There's no two-state agreement. We're further away from any sort of ceasefire deal than we've been almost in the entire 13 months that the war has been going on. I mean, how will Joe Biden, many people blame him for allowing Netanyahu to do whatever he wants when it comes to Gaza, and now what we're seeing in Lebanon as well.
To be precise, I think the Biden administration pursued a tactic of trying to contain Netanyahu by working with other Israeli leaders in the war cabinet, Benny Gantz, the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, and it didn't work. Benny Gantz left in May. Yoav Gallant was fired by Netanyahu on U.S. election day. So the fact of the matter is that I think the Biden administration should have been much tougher on Netanyahu. They should have cut military aid. They didn't do it. I think it was a tactical mistake. But I want to look forward a little bit because I think this will go beyond Joe Biden. I think what we have to realize here is that as counterproductive as the Biden approach was, that you now have a Donald Trump who told Bibi Netanyahu on the phone a few weeks ago, do what you have to do, and who has publicly said the Biden administration was too weak in supporting Israel. So even as he faces domestic pressure in Israel, even as he faces that prospect that if he ever stopped the war, he faces legal and political jeopardy, Netanyahu has a blank check from the incoming Trump administration to go even farther in the killing, whether that's in Lebanon, but I think it will continue to happen in Gaza. And so now the blood on people's hands, if you want to talk about it, it'll be blood on Trump's hands. Whether he'll be held to account like Biden was, that's an open question.
Yeah, he's made no secret, Trump has made no secret of his support of Netanyahu and Israel. Stephen, just before we go, can you just give us an idea, a sense of where this all leaves the Democratic Party? What are they going to do after all the hand-wringing and soul-searching is over? Where do they go next?
I think they really need to heal their divisions because they are really pretty strong. I mean, 80% of Democrats, for example, wanted to suspend military aid to Israel. Whereas the Biden administration, Vice President Harris, the Democratic platform, kept saying that this aid was ironclad. They would not make it conditional. We're seeing in other areas where there seems to be a degree of tone deafness to where a lot of ordinary Democrats are coming from. But the pressure from the funders, the pressure from the mainstream media is, oh, you have to be more centrist. But the only way to fight right-wing populism is left-wing populism. Going to the center does just the opposite. And that the Democratic Party really does, I think, need to be more sensitive to its working class base, to the young voters whose support they're going to need going further, the new generation, and to really recognize that the issues that concern Americans are not going to be those by this kind of cautious moderation, but the kind of excitement that can bring people forward, get back into the fold, and move things forward. So you're going to see, a lot of battles between those who have different interpretations of where to go next. But my sense is that there really does need to be a greater sensitivity to support for a social justice, for human rights, for international law, for the kinds of forward-looking progress that makes the United States less of an international outlier, not just in terms of Israel, but other things, but one that's more attuned to the needs of people at home.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, but thank you so much, Stephen, Andrew and Scott. We really do appreciate your input and insight into this, and will be fascinating to see what happens over the next 4 years. Well, thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website. That's aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Tom McRae, and the whole team, goodbye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.